From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know. This call left me with some questions, not necessarily related to the content of the call, but I do want everybody to know the call cuts a little short. It goes right up to the 3 minutes, but I think this is going to be something that's very exciting for us to explore together. Let's hear from Lionel Putz.
Hi, gents. You can call me the well-read redneck. You can use my voice and my name. And anyway, I'm calling because of everything going on with the critical race theory, the 1619 project, and then backlash, of course, that we see, burning books, etc., that there is what seems to be at least an increasing divide. I call myself well-read because I've read into the past and so forth. And one of the very distinct parallels I see is my readings about colonialism in Africa. When you read about it and really get into depth, you realize that most of the ground soldiers were simply working a job as they saw it under what they believed to be noble intentions of spreading Christianity and ending the slave trade, as Europe was getting out of the slave trade, but since some of Central Asia and so forth was still, and parts of Africa were still very much involved in the slave trade, so they saw it as a noble intention, though while they were doing that, of course, they were affecting the tribes in different ways. While they didn't see it that way because of what they were being taught and so forth. And now we go into the modern and we see how obvious oppression of Black and other minorities, I think, is pretty undeniable to most who actually take a good look into it. But we are seeming to have this backlash. We are definitely having this backlash of people who are not understanding that they're just being taught what the upper people want them to think. And I worry from everything I read and understand about these different critical race that we are not addressing that these people, poor white people that I grew up like, as why I called myself a redneck. I grew up in a poor white rural area. They're not addressing that these people aren't understanding that they are just pawns and they are being told noble intentions when it's not. Is there an effort being made that I'm not aware of?
So the last line there would be better educate these people or these groups. Let me first start by saying, Lionel, thank you so much for taking the time to drop us a line. You're raising some fantastic points here and some valid arguments. And secondly, I don't think that's your real name, dude. I I have some suspicions, but they will be fair. You can call to confirm if you wish. In this case, though, critical race theory, called CRT, is something that has ruffled a lot of feathers recently in the United States. And I think this goes line in line with the dangerous possibilities of private entities controlling virtual history, because we've done a number of examinations on the idea of controlling the past, right? The fact that history is not just a conversation, but it's often an acrimonious conversation. In some cases, it is very much like a war. Like the history books you are going to read about World War II are going to be wildly different depending on which country that high school is located in. And that's something everyone has accepted as normal. So with all of that, you have, if you've lived in the US, you have heard different comments about what's called critical race theory. From an objective standpoint, before we get to the point you raised, Lionel, from an objective standpoint, the theory or the kind of argument, the observation of critical race theory is that so many aspects of modern institutions and society and groups and communities, these institutions have racism baked within them. They are part and parcel of the thing somehow. And that is why it is so difficult to try to abolish racism. It's because, obviously, anybody who has been around human children, you know that the kids themselves don't start off liking one kind of person more than another or disliking one kind of person more than another. They just get taught this stuff in ways that are non-consensual, in ways that are often insidious and subtle. Right.
And to your point, you can feel bad about the fact they're subjected to that to a point, right? And then they become adults and are just racists at that point, right?
Well, also a lot of people, I would posit that a great many of the 8 billion currently rooming together on this planet don't think of themselves as racist.
Absolutely not. You always say that you're the hero in your own story, right?
Right. Yes. Yeah. Everybody's their own main character. And at least in my experience, your mileage may vary, folks, but in my experience, most people on some level want to think of themselves as the person who's figured it out. You're a bit of a maverick, right? Like, oh, yeah, you like one kind of music, but you're saying to yourself, I have surprising things about me. A lot of people don't know that I'm really into the history of spoons in the 18th century or whatever. I'm just making up a thing.
Fascinating history.
It is a fascinating history. So cutlery itself is a fascinating history. That is accurate. But so the idea here is something that has become a rallying cry for various, especially state level politicians in the U.S. The idea is that it is, well, the laws you'll hear in places like Idaho are laws written to ban the concept of teaching critical race theory because it is considered by those who object to it to be unfairly calling one sort of people or another inferior or superior. And this,
but isn't that what racism does?
Well, it's a bad faith argument, obviously, and the issue here is that if you look at the history of systems objectively, if you take a structural approach, we mentioned this in our mentioned this briefly in other conversations, but you guys remember when we were talking about so-called eco-terrorism earlier, we talked about the disadvantage that a lot of developed countries push upon developing countries, where they say, okay, we have historically made so much money, so much profit out of all these things that put us where we are, and we're telling you that you cannot do it. Of course, folks are going to be ticked to hear that, and you can hear arguments where people say, like, hey, that's unfairly putting a lot on me. I wasn't alive in the 1600s or what have you, or I wasn't alive in the 1800s. Right. Yeah, that's an appropriate time to say.
I'm sorry. Because I just mean it's history. Like, isn't critical race theory just about accepting the wrongs of past versions of ourselves and learning from them?
Britannica.com says critical race theory is a intellectual and social movement and loosely organized framework of legal analysis based on the premise that a race is not a natural biologically grounded feature of physically distinct subgroups of human beings, but a socially constructed, culturally invented category that is used to oppress and exploit people of color.
Yeah, 100%. Like that's the other thing. This is an academic legal concept. It is more than 40 years old. Like again, as we see so often, the eggheads, the boffins, the really, really smart people.
The boffins.
Yes, yeah.
So much.
Thank you, United Kingdom. Have been talking about this for a long time, and people in positions of political or corporate power just didn't want to talk about it. And sometimes in positions of spiritual authority, which that one especially is kind of gross, right?
Doesn't that position, though, kind of fly in the face of people that do want to have a racial identity? Like culturally? Like isn't that like sort of like denying that to people? Like who maybe like talk about blackness or like being, from a certain part of the world and how that like, affects them and changes the way they are culturally? Like, doesn't that sort of deny them the ability to make that association?
I'd love to have an expert in the field for an episode in the future, but from what I'm understanding, the primary issue is that folks are trying to explore intergenerational detriment that occurs. Like, to respond to that criticism, like, hey, I wasn't alive in the 1800s. Guess what? Most people weren't. Most things that you would consider human are not from that time period, but they are benefiting or they are suffering from the long tail consequences of the events that occurred at that time. So like one great example would be to take the concept of mortgage interest deduction. Shout out to everybody who didn't fall asleep right as I hypnotized you with those three very boring words. We're not going to talk about math. Right. We're not going to talk about math too much. I promise. Promise.
And just to be clear, I was just responding, and Matt, correct me if I misunderstood. The definition that you read is saying that race in and of itself is a construct. Whole like full stop, right?
Yeah.
I'm just saying there are some people of a certain. No, I'm saying there are some people of a certain race that would say that's bullshit, and that it means something to be a certain race. And there are people that use that in a really nasty way too, like white supremacists. So it is complicated and confusing. Which version of owning a race is good and which is bad is I think the question that this brings up.
The next part from Britannica is, critical race theorists hold that racism is inherent in the law and legal institutions of the United States, insofar as they function to create and maintain social, economic, and political inequalities between whites and non-whites, especially African Americans.
Well, I don't like it when people just describe like whites or blah, blah, blah. These are all people. If you're listening to this, you're a person. Everybody else is surprisingly similar to you, despite the varied circumstances of their history, their past, or their future. Like we always emphasize, people want the same stuff. People don't like to think of themselves as bad. No one wants to be bad, or most people don't want to be bad. But this is true.
That was Britannica, remember.
Right. That's Britannica. And they have their own history, for sure. But the thing is that if you really look at the big picture, humanity is all in some way related. And people have their own identities that have been at times foisted upon them, perhaps, or associations, or identities that feel like core definitions of their prime personality and their experience. And if that is the case, people should be able to do that. But the problem with racism, really, like for many people, especially people in power, it incentivizes a lack of critical thinking. I draw our attention once again to that Monopoly experiment I referenced in Does Being Wealthy Make You a Bad Person? Because people are great at rationalizing away their advantages and saying, no, I'm actually just really good. The odds weren't stacked in my favor. It's not like the other people were running the same race having to carry a backpack of bricks. It's just that I'm super good. Unfortunately, that is, while that might be a little bit of cognitive umami for a lot of people, it's not true. And civilization inherits these things. I always remember the poem by Philip Larkin, which has a terrible title. The title is This Be the Verse. Ignore the title. He was wrong on the title. But the poem itself, which I hope everybody gets a chance to read, speaks a little bit about inhumanity to man, about intergenerational trauma, and about the effects of it that haunt this species like a shadow since the dawn of this species. And this means that when we see things that are institutionalized, there's not an isolated incident of some like boss hog type figure saying, I really hate insert here group. Like I really dislike the Roma. I don't like the Roma in my town. Or, these Welsh are overrunning the VA, City Hall, Lions Club, whatever.
Pinnacle
Just
Club?
pick an example.
Local Applebee's.
Local Applebee's. They're ruining the Applebee's.
4-H.
Right. But the reality of the situation is, here's where you get to Lionel Putz's points. Class warfare is a real thing. We've found numerous examples of this, and the people and institutions in power, almost anywhere you go, are glad to exploit those divides. George Carlin, who is often a great orator, often confused with a stand-up comedian, but I think history will prove my assessment correct. George Carlin has a great point where he says there's a big club. You're not in it. You know what I mean? Like it is to the advantage and to the benefit of a very harmful status quo and hierarchy to divide people and set them in opposition as much as possible. Because when you keep the great majority of human beings, who again all just want the same thing, they all want their friends and their loved ones to be safe and to think they're cool. If all of those people had an honest conversation about ways to make things better, it would present serious existential challenges to the status quo.